have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
I grew up, in Ohio in the 1990s. I was surrounded by what you can call the religious right, the evangelical Christians. And we've always had Christianity in the U.S. society, but the religious right, the evangelical Christian right, the Mike Pence people, that stuff started in the 1970s. And that's a particular, the mega church phenomenon. That stuff is something that is a specific trend in U.S. history. What happened was, TV changed America's mind, right? I mean, TV is a huge invention. It changed U.S. society drastically, right? Everyone had world events shown to them in their living room. McCarthyism used TV. Americans, we thought the Soviets were our friends during World War II, but we all of a sudden we had this talking box in our home that scared the crap out of us. Oh my God, there was communists under every bed and every rock, and they're going to invade, they're going to nuke us, and TV psyched up the American people for McCarthyism.
Recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces.
Scared the crap out of Americans and, got Americans who had liked communists and liked the labor movement and liked Roosevelt to be wild, fanatical anti-communists, right? They got brainwashed by TV. But, because the anti-communism spun out of control, and you had like the U.S. Army being accused of being communists and all kinds of crazy stuff happening. There was a member of Congress who committed suicide because he was blackmailed by Joe McCarthy. And so what happened? TV undid McCarthyism. Edward R. Murrow and American TV turned against Joe McCarthy, and ruined his reputation, and he drank himself to death. And the liberals had the upper hand. Starting in the late 50s, early 60s, the liberals had the upper hand on American TV. And it was the liberals who had the upper hand. And, the Beatles, right? Beatles, rock and roll musicians, right? Where did rock and roll music come from? Well, rock and roll is based on African-American spiritual music, right? African-American spiritual music, eventually you get blues out of that, and eventually you get rock music. That's where rock and roll came from. And, rock and roll music, it was originally among African-Americans. It was praise music, and then you had the blues and all of that. But, in American Pentecostal churches, right? Pentecostalism is a form of Christianity. They talk about charismatic Christianity, where people, they shake and they believe that God comes into the room when they're praying, and they shake violently, and and their music was different than other Christian music, mainly because it was about kind of inducing a trance state. It was more hypnotic, right? Regular hymns, church hymns don't do that. But Pentecostalism, and it soon spread, as white people were doing this too, they would get kind of hypnotized in the church service. They'd be shaking and yelling and speaking in tongues, and all of that was going on. And that was like an American religious tradition. Was that, you had among working class people, it started out with black people, but also among white people, you had these religious practices where people would start speaking in tongues, they would handle snakes, they would handle poisonous snakes, they would light themselves on fire, they would get into a trance state, you'd have heavy drums playing, and people would, and it was, perhaps it was inspired by some African traditional practices, and it was a religious trend in U.S. society among working class people where people would get into kind of hypnotic states as they were praying, and they would use African American like spiritual music, but with a heavy drum beat. That's where rock music comes from. So the Beatles came along, and the Beatles, it was basically this kind of religious music without the religion involved.
Their shrieks rise in an awesome wave. Our staff scientist, in an odd moment, calculated that this young mob is generating enough energy to put 3 Atlas missiles in orbit and power 54,000 transistor radios.
The Beatles would have these big concerts, and the Beatles toured the United States. And they toured the United States, and they went to Tennessee, and they went to Memphis, and they went to Alabama, and they toured the United States, and it scared the crap out of a lot of religious people, because people, these auditoriums would be full of teenagers who liked the Beatles, liked their music, and the Beatles would do the exact same thing that Pentecostal pastors would do, right? They would, the Beatles would be there and they'd be singing Twist and Shout or whatever. But the Beatles, they had figured out how to get their audience watch the videos. Beatlemania, right? Beatlemania, where the crowds of teenage girls are chasing the Beatles, right?
40 young ladies fainted, but authorities feel that some were playing possum, so that they might be lifted over the fence and thus be nearer their idols. The Beatles, who originated as a small-time act out of Liverpool, now have no rivals as the kingpins of the teenage set. You can repeat that loud and long.
And those, you watch those videos, they're getting their audience into a trance state. The girls are all screaming and crying and moving back and forth, and they're able to induce a hypnotic trance state from their audience, but there's no religion involved. That's why pastors would burn Beatles albums and say that rock and roll was satanic. Well, it scared the crap out of them, because what they would do at their church services in order to prove they were, this kind of, you could almost call it sorcery or magic that they would do to get their audience to think they were God, or to think that their religion was correct. Now the Beatles could do, and so it was like a threat to them.
The Beatles made a statement in all the newspapers that they're getting better than Jesus himself, and the Ku Klux Klan, being a religious order, is going to come out here the night that they appear at the Coliseum here, and we're going to demonstrate with different ways and tactics to stop this performance. The Klan is going to come out here because we're the only organization that will come out and make a stop to these accusations. This is nothing but blasphemy.
And the Beatles were pushing kind of a new left message, right? The Beatles protested the Vietnam War. The Beatles, it was associated with more liberal views about sexuality and such. So you had kind of a feeling among middle America that rock and roll and all of that was a threat. All of this culminates in the civil rights movement and the black liberation movement and the rise of the 1960s. And, the hippie movement is very much a pushback against McCarthyism. Right, with rock and roll music, with long people, growing long hair and beards. McCarthyism is very military. Everyone has short hair, and everyone's very strict and traditional. And the hippies are practicing free love and listening to rock music and growing their hair long and doing drugs. And it's a reaction to McCarthyism. Among the hippies, you have a group of people they call Jesus freaks. And it was just a variant of hippies. There were all kinds of hippies. There were hippies that were really into drugs. There were hippies that were really into activism, and some became communists, Students for a Democratic Society, the Weathermen. There were hippies who were into farming, and there were hippies there were all kinds of hippies. It was just a cultural phenomenon. Basically, it was young people growing their hair long and listening to rock music. It was a cultural thing. There was one particular brand of hippie that they called Jesus freaks, and those were hippie Christians. And most of them were Roman Catholic at the beginning, right? And it was just, they were being hippies, and they were Christians, and they adopted the ichthus, the symbol of Christianity. The fish became their symbol, and they would stand on street corners and sing hymns on their guitars and talk about Jesus was like a revolutionary who believed in love, man, and whatever. It was just, they were the Jesus freaks, right? They're hippies, right? And hippie Christians, right? And it made sense. But at the time, right, TV, the Beatles, among young people, the left or liberals had the upper hand because, all the TV and all the rock music was pushing like a liberal left-wing message. So conservatives were losing out among young people. Young people didn't want to hear about Christianity. Young people were not joining churches. Young people were not joining the military. They had a draft. So the right wing is like having a huddle with Richard Nixon, and they're having a huddle. How do we get the young people back? So the spiritual advisor of Richard Nixon was Reverend Billy Graham. He was probably one of the most famous pastors in U.S. history, Reverend Billy Graham. Reverend Billy Graham talks to Richard Nixon. Reverend Billy Graham had these broadcasts where he would give his religious message. He started having hippie Jesus freaks play songs, right? Reverend Billy Graham, he would give his sermons, but before he would, give his sermon, he would have a couple Jesus freaks with their long hair come out and, play songs on their guitars or something. And you would see long-haired Jesus freaks on Billy Graham's thing. Billy Graham was a right-wing conservative.
Don't ever say it's a white man's religion or a black man's religion. It's a world religion. He belongs to the world.
He was an anti-Semite and said a lot of things to Richard Nixon about Jews that are not very nice. And he was certainly not a hippie, and he was certainly a supporter of the Vietnam War, but, started having Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. And there's 2 Broadway musicals that are aimed at Jesus freaks. The first is Jesus Christ Superstar by Andrew Lloyd Webber. The second is Godspell. And these are 2 Broadway musicals that they then immediately make into movies that are promoting Jesus freaks.
There's a Broadway play right now entitled Godspell, a musical version of St. Matthew's Gospel. There's a new movie right now called Brother John, in which Sidney Poitier plays Jesus Christ in the form of an Alabama black man. The front cover of Life magazine a few weeks ago ran Jesus Christ Superstar. And this rock opera from England was confronting young people with one question: who is Jesus Christ? An 87-minute long electronic probe into the life of Jesus.
Rock and roll music with hippie aesthetics promoting Christianity. And so, the right wing is saying, okay, well, the hippie thing is big among young people, but there's this one group of young people that are religious, and religion's a big part of what it means to be a conservative. So maybe this is like a way we can recruit young people to be conservative. So they start pouring money into Jesus freaks. And, you have the 2 Jesus freak Broadway musicals, Superstar and Godspell. Billy Graham has, Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. So then what happened is they imported Reverend Sun Myung Moon to the United States, this crazy Korean pastor, right, who believes he's the second coming of Jesus, very extreme religious beliefs, and he's a fanatical anti-communist. He's kind of a fascist, if you really look at his beliefs. He believes like Koreans are the master race, and they're going to lead. He's the second coming of Christ to unite the global Christians, to wage a crusade against communism. And he's tied to the dictator of South Korea, Park Chung-hee. Richard Nixon flies, Sun Myung Moon to the United States and has Sun Myung Moon start recruiting hippies, right? And he sets up these communes, and people think it's just a hippie commune, and then they get there, and it turns out they're followers of Reverend Moon, they're Moonies.
When the unifying force of God leaves America, nothing will be able to hold America together. The family will break down, churches will divide, and America will become mostly ill because the cells of her body are decaying. This will be the perfect opportunity for the evil of communism to overtake America. People are fleeing from the communist world of slavery to the free world. United, the free world must liberate the enslaved communist world. This time, our task is build one world under God.
Also, there's a guy named Reverend Tony Alamo. And, this guy's a Beatles marketer in Los Angeles. He's like a record company exec. And he has some kind of religious experience and decides he's like a prophet of God. So he starts his, Alamo Ministries. He has a cult. And there's a bunch of them, right? And again, among the Jesus freaks, right, you have these groups that look like they're kind of left-wing groups, the Moonies, the Alamo Ministries and stuff. But when you really get to know them, they're conservative, they're Republican, they're right-wing. And so basically, it's starting to work out. And you have conservative Christianity among Protestants kind of being reinvented to involve rock and roll music, to involve a very watered-down message. Like, people talk about the Jesus freaks are very different than traditional Christians in the United States. Traditional Christians can tell you the difference between a Presbyterian and a Methodist and a Catholic. The Jesus freaks, they sit there, it's about love, man. It's about love. I don't care none of that. It's about the Bible. It's about love, brother. Love, brother. I just love the Bible. I love Jesus. It's like Christianity for dummies, almost, right? It's like, I love Jesus. And it's like watered down, right? So, the right wing is realizing that in order to recruit young people who grew up listening to Beatles music and grew up watching television, in order to recruit them to be conservative right-wing Christians, you can't recruit them to be Presbyterians or fundamental Baptists or regular. You got to have this like watered-down, dumb rock and roll Christianity in order to get boomers, basically. In order to recruit boomers to be conservative right-wing Christians, you have to have dumb Christianity. You can't have the old, like, really complicated Christianity, right? So, by about 1978, Reverend Jerry Falwell, he becomes the voice of a whole new movement that's spreading across the United States that's like this. They play rock and roll music, they play things on guitars, and it's Christianity watered down, right? We don't know anything about Martin Luther. We don't know anything about the Reformation, man. It's about love, brother. Jesus loves you. He loves you. We got to listen to the Bible. Every word in the Bible is true. It's the word of God. It says it in the Bible, right? And then you get the bumper stickers, right? There's a bumper sticker I absolutely hated to see when I was a kid. It would say, God said it. I believe it. That settles it, right? It was a bumper sticker. People were proud of it. God says it. I believe it. And that settles it. What does that mean? I don't know, right? It's like, haven't people been interpreting the Bible in thousands of different ways for thousands of years? I don't know. God says it. I believe it. That settles it, right? And you get this reinvention of Protestant Christianity. The mega churches, Jerry Falwell, and what now is called the religious right, and still has a huge amount of influence among the military. Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence is one of these. Amy Coney Barrett, who just got sworn into the U.S. Supreme Court. She's like a Catholic Pentecostal. She's part of the People of Praise, community, which is like a Catholic evangelical spinoff. And that this movement, this watered down rock and roll Christianity, that's kind of how the Reagan, neoconservative Reaganomic trend was able to take over. So the question I got to ask is, why do we have so many pro-life conservative Christians in the United States? It's because of this. That basically, in the early 70s, conservatives figured out that in order to, basically recruit baby boomers, they needed to invent a kind of watered-down version of Christianity, kind of a rock and roll hippie Christianity that they could recruit people with. And I grew up around that stuff, and look, I was an atheist when I was in high school. I was an absolute atheist because I couldn't stand this stuff. I really, still to this day, I cannot stand the evangelical stuff. It really grinds my gears. I am not an evangelical, and, it's not my cup of tea. And deep respect if someone's watching and they are an evangelical. I respect your faith and all of that, but I could not stand evangelicals. It's a very obnoxious trend. There's kind of a lack of critical thinking that goes with it. And, the megachurch stuff was something Republicans invented in order to get the upper hand over the liberals after the 1960s, basically. Liberals came out of the 1960s winning, and so then you had the evangelical stuff was their way to come back. I think Kevin Sorbo, who played Hercules in the Hercules TV show, he now makes evangelical movies, right? There's a movie, God Is Not Dead, and he plays this like evil professor who's trying to convince his student not to believe in God. And, there's whole TV networks where you can watch nothing but evangelical movies. And, I think Mike Huckabee, right? He's a Fox News host who's also like an evangelical. And this is a whole big part of U.S. society. It's a whole, political/religious movement that was formed in the early 70s. And probably reached its peak with George W. Bush. I think the height of that was George W. Bush. When George W. Bush, was president, this is kind of the height of these people's power. And it's in decline now, I would argue. The evangelical movement in the United States is in decline, but this is where it came from.